Welcome to our August Bite-Sized Corrosion series, where we've been looking at water and water contamination. It is my absolute delight and privilege to welcome Dr. Anthony Turton back to the microphone today. And in our last discussion, we looked at acid mine drainage, what we know, what we should be doing, and to some extent what we are not doing. And if you missed it, it is already up on YouTube, as well as a link to a fascinating paper written by Anthony about 12 years ago, which actually sparked this conversation. So Anthony, a warm welcome back to you, and thank you for taking time out of your evening to be with us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always good to talk to technically competent people about these things.
Thank you. I know that you don't call yourself a corrosion expert, but I do know that you have a lot to offer us as we now start to explore some of the corrosion considerations attributed to AMD. And during our offline discussions, you mentioned that not all asset owners have actually buried their heads in the sand, but that there have been some responses to the panic related to AMD. And I thought it would be helpful to explore this a little. Would you like to lead the way?
Yes, it's a bit of a sensitive topic because there's client confidentiality involved, and I can't obviously betray that. But we were approached, when I say we, I was part of a technical team a couple of years ago, and we were approached by one of the bulk providers in Gauteng, and they wanted to know what the risk was that they were facing as a result of acid mine drainage. Now, what you need to appreciate was that because the AMD thing was a fast-breaking story and no one really fully understood it at the time, there were certain assumptions underpinning these the risk perceptions. And the main assumption was that acidic water will infiltrate into the pipe and it will become part and parcel of the reticulation system. And that's an interesting thing, but let's just dwell on that for a short moment, because there was a very major study done by the Department of Water and Sanitation called the Vaal River Salinity Study.
That's right, yes.
And that salinity study has shown that the Vaal River is becoming more saline. And the two major contributors of salinity are, in fact, non-point source flow of acidic water from the Witwatersrand goldfields. And then the other source of contamination or salinity is the return flow from the many, many wastewater treatment works. So it was against that background that the assumption was that it's the acid inside the water that's going to damage the pipes from inside. I was brought into the team given the work that I've been doing, particularly on those preferential flow paths, that paper of mine that you've got up, that worked on the concept of flow pathways. And I tried to isolate flow pathway A, B, C, D. I just gave them names. And just to try and understand how we could potentially model these things to get our head around it. So within that particular team, it was actually led by Professor Chris Hartnady, who is a professor of geology from UCT. He also owned a consulting company down in consultants down in the Western Cape. And he was the team leader, and we had a pipeline guy called Alistair Goins. He was the pipeline expert in that team. And my role there was to try and conceptualize how the flow of AMD might become a risk to buried assets. So let me just quickly give you some background there just to help. So the first thing that we did was we started building a mathematical model, and we had to input certain parameters and certain data into that model. The first thing that came up was the porosity of tailings, or the permeability of tailings. And tailings are extremely impermeable things. Because the particle size is so small, the interstitial spaces are also so small. So the capillary attraction is very high within that space. So once that's saturated, it doesn't flow through very easily. So it's generally quite impervious. And I sort of hit on this impervious thing, and I started looking around. And so the first thing that we did was we created a map of every single tailings dump in the whole Witwatersrand goldfields. We got a GIS, could calculate the volume of every single dump. And then we could also get characterization of what the dump was made of, and they weren't all equal. Some had more uranium than others, etc. So we could get that kind of, at least that level of granularity was available. But then what we found out was that many of the dumps had been built on top of, believe it or not, dolomite. In the Western Basin, they built some of those dumps on dolomite for the stated reason. Remember that these dumps were sited in the early 1900s. It was believed at that point in time that by putting a dump on a bit of high ground, you would facilitate the drainage of water away from the dump. And that became a very, very key part in understanding the flow pathways, because all of the dumps are either located on top of dolomite, which is not a good thing to do, we now know. And the other thing is that they are located on top of a quaternary catchment watershed divide. And the significance of that is that in almost all cases, the underlying host geology tends to be basement granite and Witwatersrand quartzite, Wits quartzite. And I mentioned now the porosity of tailings is very low. And guess what? The porosity of Wits quartzite is also extremely low. So you've got two extremely low porosity materials at play here now. So we've put that into the model, and we started working out a risk profile of every single dump in the entire Witwatersrand goldfields, and we could get a handle on, on what was happening there. But then the next question now was, when you're looking at buried pipelines, because you are burying your pipeline typically in Wits quartzite, Wits quartzite being as impervious as it is, you dig a square trench, and these pipes might be 1.2 meter diameter pipes. You might be burying the pipe 3 or 4 meters under the ground, and you've got to have a certain gradient on the pipe and whatever. So what you would do is you would fill the square trench that you make with material that would take the load, take the weight of the pipe, and that would typically be river sand. You're putting a porous substance into an impervious substrate. And
you've created a lovely channel.
And that created a preferential flow path. And that was an important part of the model. We started modeling that. Then we said, right, so the third thing that started happening now was we started seeing that in almost all cases, as close to tailings dam, you tend to get some kind of water course that's typically characterized by a wetland, a flay or something like that. So then we could start modeling now what the hydraulic gradient is. So you get a hydraulic gradient from the top of the dump to the lowest point being the wetland. So you could get a transect across that. You could work out the hydraulic gradient, and we got all those numbers, and we started crunching it around. And then we started saying, right, now what happens if you've got a pipeline that goes between the tailings dam and a wetland, and it happens to be, if it's quartzite, that it's got very low porosity, and you're now introducing a linear aquifer. You're constructing an aquifer around the pipeline. And we modeled all of that stuff. Then we started saying, right, well, of the thousands of kilometers of pipelines that were potentially at risk, we now came down to a relatively small number. I can't remember the exact number, but it was certainly less than 100. And then so from that, we could start whittling down again. And then we started saying, right, well, if that's the case, where do we have another factor that plays a role is the presence of high voltage Eskom transmission lines.
I'm interested you say that. What is it about the lines that you associated with corrosion? We now know about AC corrosion, but in that era, we didn't really.
Well, at that stage, we were working on first principles entirely. And in fact, we didn't have an electrical engineer in our team, believe it or not. So we were just a bunch of people fiddling around there. And we figured out that with your high voltage transmission lines, you're likely to have an electromagnetic field around the lines. And one of the things that we do know about acid mine drainage is that it's got a very high TDS, total dissolved solids, made up mostly of sulfate, which is very conductive. So your electrical conductivity changes. So therefore, the hypothesis that we put forward, and we didn't prove it at the time, but the hypothesis was that if you happen to have a steel pipeline going through a piece of land between a tailings dam and a flay, in the presence of a high voltage power line, that is where your risk is likely to be the highest. And we modeled it all in, boom, 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 and we put it in there. I'd like to sort of say for dramatic purposes that we could press the button and say, so, show us where that place would be. And it wasn't quite like that, but let's just think hypothetically, we could model all of this now. And then we started looking on the map at where all of these preconditions come together. And bingo, we found a place, and I'll tell you exactly where the place is. And the place was at the end of the M2 highway going east towards Springs. So there's a high voltage Eskom testing center there. They test high voltage power lines and I don't know, whatever, conductors and insulators and whatever. And there's some very innocuous looking mine dumps there, very, very unimposing compared to some of the seriously big mine dumps, the Top Star mine dump that was an impressive mine dump. These were very unimpressive mine dumps. In fact, you had to really look to see that they were there. But that was according to our model where the highest likelihood of corrosion would take place. And we reported that back to the client. And they said, funny, you should mention that because we have been replacing pipelines in that area ad infinitum and we never knew why. Then a very dramatic moment occurred. We went onto Google Earth and we actually used the historic data, the photographic data from the satellites. And we looked at that particular part of the pipeline network. And lo and behold, we actually found a big damp patch in the middle of a highway. And that damp patch in the middle of the highway was, in fact, exactly what we're talking about.
A burst pipe.
You could, in fact, see it. You could actually see it. And it was a fantastic moment because it kind of validated our theoretical model. And from that, we could go back to the original work and say that of the thousands of kilometers of pipeline we're dealing with, where there are hundreds of potential points of intersection, maybe 10 are of concern. We could literally whittle it down to almost single digits. Certainly double-digit numbers, but in the low double digits, 10, 15, something like that. And that was really a very, very important moment. And then there was another point of validation that occurred because there's another pipeline. It's a pipeline that delivers water out to Rustenburg. And that pipeline goes past a massive tailings dam. It goes between what is known as the Millsite Complex Dam. And what the interesting thing about that tailings dam, it's the only tailings dam in the Wits Goldfields that is not in the Vaal River catchment. It's actually over the catchment into the catchment of the Limpopo. So it's over the continental watershed divide. And what was interesting there is that's dolomite area. And in that dolomite area, there was a massive anomaly because the CSIR had been doing a lot of research on acid mine drainage from the decant at Tuelopi Spruit, the old Western Cons mine where I used to work at that point in time. And there was an anomaly that was coming up all the time. They could never ever get the mass balanced data right. So what was measured going in at one end wasn't coming out. There was a different number coming along. And then we could say, that different number, in fact, is this intersection that Wits Quartzite that you created a preferential pathway by putting in river sand. And they sort of crunched the numbers there and that kind of balanced the equation, as close as we could get. So that's it. It was all very exciting stuff and it was all sort of first principle development work. But it showed us, I think, that the acid mine drainage problem is not what we thought it would be. The answers are counterintuitive. And ultimately, it comes down to, if we're going to extrapolate up from the information that we picked up there, the risk areas, I would now say, are things like oil and gas pipelines, things like maybe railway lines, certainly buildings, structural steel that has been built on reclaimed tailings facilities areas. I would say those are probably the big risk areas from a corrosion perspective, rather than the risk of infiltration into the drinking water system of the country. That is probably the lowest risk of all of them.
That's quite encouraging, though, because it did do away with that sort of panic that, suddenly we're all drinking concentrated acid, which, of course, is how the media always hypes these things, but also really encouraging that doing this fundamental conceptual modeling has proven itself in practice and is now a very practical mechanism in which you can ascertain, well, what is the risk in these specific locations when I'm building infrastructure?
Yes, so what we did with that particular model was we literally looked at every single tailings dam. So we modeled every tailings dam in the entire Wits Goldfields. The problem, the downside of that whole thing was that the project was classified and taken out of the public domain, which I think is a great shame because the knowledge that's contained in it, I think, is of great use to other people. And I think it would be very worthwhile at some point in time to try and get this thing declassified and get it put out in the public domain, because there will be many other people that are interested in it. And of course, the client in this case, I would argue, was being very proactive in anticipating a risk long before it came. So there's a lot of good brownie points that can be scored from this thing. In the current climate where government is being hammered for being reactive rather than proactive, I think this is a good example of proactivity and coming up with some very relatively low-cost solutions, simply because you understand the underlying dynamics involved.
Exactly. And I think as you started our conversation the last time we spoke, was that as soon as we've defined the problem, we can start finding the solutions. And here we're well on that way. It does seem a little sad that we don't have easy access to the information. So yeah, maybe we need to start an initiative to try, as you say, to get it declassified. And I think once you know that you are in a problem area, as you've alluded, you can start looking in more depth at your problem to try and get you a tailor-made solution.
Yes, I think problems are your friends. If you're in the engineering community, you want to work with problems because problems are technically soluble. And you want to identify the problem correctly, because if you don't identify the problem correctly, you then have a misdiagnosed problem for which you apply an inappropriate solution. And inappropriate solutions are very often very costly solutions. You want to diagnose the problem correctly. And if anyone's been following any of the stuff that I've been writing or speaking about recently, I talk about the need to do a proper diagnosis. You need to understand what the nature of the risk is. When an airplane falls out the sky, they do a big investigation and they find the cause of the problem, and a root cause analysis. That's what you need. The root cause analysis enables you to adequately identify what we're dealing with, and then you very quickly start seeing that there's a range of options available to you. But I think more importantly, and I put this out now maybe as a plea to government agencies that might be listening now, we currently have a trust deficit in South Africa. And I think that's one of the problems. People don't believe in what the state is saying anymore. And I would argue that part of rebuilding trust would, in fact, be to say, listen, we were actually proactive about these things, and this is what it is. Let's be open and frank about it. These things are manageable. The fact is, we're living in a post-mining economy in South Africa, although many people still think that we're in an active mining phase. But in reality, we are transitioning to a post-mining economy, where the unintended consequences of a century and a half of mining are now becoming constraints to future growth and future economic activity. So unless we identify that problem correctly, we're simply going to keep bluffing ourselves that we're still mining and keep bluffing ourselves that the problems aren't what they think what we thought they were. So ultimately, we've got to restore confidence and trust. And I would say that this particular project would be a fantastic way of doing that, because I actually think it was I'm very proud to be part of that team. The client was very proactive. They got way ahead of the curve. And they could never ever get up there and shout from the rooftops that they were proactive, and I don't know why. That's a tragedy.
A lost opportunity, yes. Just something that we haven't mentioned, and a thought has come to me. You mentioned that part of the challenge with the acid mine drainage is the dissolution of the sulfates. And of course, one thing that we've not mentioned at all, and it would be particularly evident in those flay areas, is the increase in the prevalence of sulfate-reducing bacteria. And they are awful in terms of causing external corrosion of a pipeline. As soon as there's no oxygen, which of course you don't have when you're in a flay or a marshy area, those high levels of the sulfate provide the necessary fuel for the little bugs. And as I often say, we love to think of sulfate-reducing bacteria as chomping through the steel, and that's not what they do, but it's effectively what the result is. So that's another component on the corrosion side that needs to be brought into that.
I know of a water plant at a mine, a major mine, a De Beers mine, in fact. They lost an entire water processing plant through sulfur-reducing bacteria. So they had to reconstruct the entire plant. It'd be interesting to get someone that knows about that particular aspect. But my understanding was that they lost the plant because they got SRBs in it. And so you're correct. In fact, what's also interesting now is when we start getting into the microbiological side. There's a colleague of mine from the University of Free State who became very internationally famous when she was part of a team that identified bacteria living about 2 or 3 kilometers below the surface of the earth, down some of the deepest mines in the far western basin. And what's interesting about those bacteria was that they very extremely primitive bacteria, but they survive in a very hostile environment without any sunlight or ever in their lives. And they metabolize uranium. They uranium metabolizers. And as a result of that published work, that was published in some of the most prestigious international journals, Nature and Science, published her, and then she was taken up into a NASA team as a result of that work, such as from University of Free State, working on extremophiles and what life forms might be found in hostile spaces and in outer space. So there's some really interesting things. And I think the point I want to make is that in our wetlands that drain our acid mine drainage areas, we are likely to find an extremely interesting amount of microbiota. And those microbiota deserve to be studied properly for a number of reasons. And unfortunately, one of the problems is that these wetlands are starting to be attacked by zama miners, because the wetlands also naturally concentrate gold, but they naturally concentrate uranium as well. So when you start disturbing the sediments there, your uranium that is speciated out in the sediment and has become relatively safe and inert, now gets exposed to different redox conditions, and suddenly it becomes mobile once again. And I think that is not in our collective best interest. But certainly from a microbiological perspective, I think there would be a lot of interesting studies to be done there about the use of wetlands, and particularly the microbiota in wetlands for the treatment of waste, highly hazardous waste. That's not necessarily in your field, but I think that would be a very interesting area of research going forward.
Fascinating, yeah. Well, Anthony, yet again, a fascinating conversation. The question comes from someone who's doing some water footprinting in the Western Basin at Wismut uranium mine, and using gold production data to calculate the mine void size, and trying to ascertain how much gold was reclaimed from dumps compared to what was taken from underground from the Western Basin. Do we have any of that information? Do we know about the dumps being remined?
All of that data is available. That model of ours that I mentioned, that made use of that type of data. And in general, as a rule of thumb, you can say that for every ton of tailings, there's about 1/3 of a gram of gold in the tailings dams. That's kind of what it is. But the way the question is posed, I can tell you straight away now that there is a false assumption there. And I will stick my neck out and say it's a false assumption. And the false assumption is that you can calculate the size of the void by calculating the size of the dump. So the assumption is that if you've taken it out of the ground, you've left a negative space down there of the same size.
Volume.
But in reality, it's not like that. And I'll explain why. Your stratigraphy around the mine, or your geology overhead, is such that it becomes geotechnically unstable when you mine it out. You must remember that our reefs generally dip at about an angle about 30 degrees plus minus, and they are sandwiched. They're like layer upon layer upon layer that go like that, at a depth. So when you mine them, you mine out an entire stope as much as you possibly can, and because they are parallel in their seams, one's above the other, you mine multiple stopes at different levels. And this becomes extremely unstable over time. So therefore, what they've done is they've left pillars in place, and these pillars are very sophisticated because they have to be physically located one above the other, and you can't necessarily see it when you're down in the void. But the point I wish to make is that you get a fall of ground after stoping has happened, and the rock naturally expands, so the void actually closes out over time. And if you're looking at the very deep mines, for example, the far Western Basin mines, a stope might be 900 millimeters high when you are mining it. So it's a relatively small stope, but within 2 or 3 months, that stope will have closed out to nothing. So all of your wooden packs that you leave behind, the pressure at that depth, that we're talking 2 kilometers underground, the pressure there is such that the stope literally closes out. On the shallower mines, I've been down on the Western Basin, where we did a study to try and see what we could do with the mine void. The old Princess mine, what is known as D shaft, we went down there to do a reconnaissance, and all of those stopes are relatively shallow. They're less than 100 meters in depth below surface, but they all closing out. There's fall of ground that will eventually propagate all the way up to the surface. So structures on top of the ground will eventually collapse. And in fact, that's another risk, but that's not a corrosion risk, and that is the risk of the fall of ground resulting from zama activity, because where you've got infrastructure like roads, highways, and buildings, and of course railway lines,
you're going to get subsidence.
They will eventually all become unstable, but that's only for the shallow stoping. Long story short, the void is closing out or has closed out. So you can't accurately say that because I've got X volume of a mine dump, that there's that hole in the ground. That doesn't quite work like that.
Well, Anthony, thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much again for availing yourself to share your knowledge, your expertise. We really do appreciate it. Thanks so much.